It was the kind of case that captivated the nation. Jessica Washley, a 24-year-old woman from a quiet suburb outside Portland, had vanished without a trace. A talented artist and beloved figure in her community, Jessica's sudden disappearance shocked her family, friends, and neighbors. But as the days passed, what began as a missing person case quickly unraveled into something far darker, something that would ultimately end in murder, deception, and betrayal. Jessica had been in a tumultuous relationship with her ex-boyfriend, Blake Murray. Their breakup had been messy, filled with public arguments, accusations, and restraining orders. By the time she disappeared, Blake was already under a cloud of suspicion. It didn't help that he had a volatile temper and a history of domestic disturbances. For the police, it seemed like a clear-cut case of a relationship gone terribly wrong. But the truth, as it would later be uncovered, was far more sinister. Jessica wasn't dead. At least, not at first. Months before she vanished, Jessica had begun planning something drastic. Her life was spiraling out of control. The relationship with Blake had left her scarred and paranoid, convinced that he would never leave her alone. She wanted out, not just from Blake, but from her entire life. She dreamed of disappearing, of starting over somewhere far away, somewhere she could be free. But running away wasn't enough. Jessica wanted revenge. She wanted Blake to suffer for everything he'd put her through. So, she concocted a plan that would see her dead and Blake behind bars for her murder. Jessica began laying the groundwork. She reached out to old contacts, bought a burner phone, rented an isolated cabin in the woods under a fake name, and started accumulating the tools she'd need to fake her own death. She made sure her friends and family knew she was afraid of Blake, planting seeds of suspicion long before she disappeared. Then came the night she put her plan into motion. Jessica staged her apartment to look like a struggle had taken place. She smashed a few items, left some blood, taken from an old injury, smeared across the floor, and then vanished. She left her car parked in a nearby wooded area, its doors open, her belongings scattered on the ground as if she'd been abducted. And just like that, Jessica Washley was gone. For weeks, the media buzzed with speculation. Search parties combed the woods, volunteers pinned up flyers with her picture, and Jessica watched it all unfold from her hideout in the cabin. She kept a low profile, careful not to leave any trace of her existence. Blake was the prime suspect from the beginning. His shaky alibi, combined with their history, made him an easy target for the police. Within a month, he was arrested and charged with Jessica's disappearance, his face plastered across news channels as the monster who had killed her. It was perfect. Jessica had won. But then Christian found her. Christian Collins had always been a little too clever for his own good. A mutual friend of both Jessica and Blake, Christian had known about their toxic relationship, but he had kept his distance when things fell apart. Outwardly, Christian seemed like the kind of guy you could trust, charming, polite, and intelligent, but underneath, there was something darker lurking. Christian had his suspicions from the beginning. Something about Jessica's disappearance didn't sit right with him. Blake was no saint, but Christian knew he wasn't capable of murder. And Jessica? She was smart, calculating. Faking her own death seemed like exactly the kind of thing she'd do. So, Christian started digging. He used connections he'd built up over the years, talking to people who might have seen Jessica or who knew where she might be hiding. Eventually, through a string of favors and some good old-fashioned bribery, he found her cabin. But instead of going to the police with what he knew, Christian saw an opportunity, a way to settle some old scores. The night Christian showed up at Jessica's cabin, she was startled but not afraid. At first, she thought he was there to help her, that maybe he had come to offer some kind of support or congratulate her on her perfect plan. She was wrong. Christian wasn't interested in helping. He was interested in control. In power. And now, he held all the cards. Christian cornered Jessica in the cabin, using her own burner phone to threaten her. He told her that if she didn't do exactly what he said, he'd turn her in, ruin everything, and leave her to rot in prison. Jessica, desperate to keep her plan intact, tried to reason with him, but Christian had other ideas. For weeks, he kept her there, trapped in the cabin. He took her phone, her car keys, anything she could use to escape. Jessica was helpless, a prisoner in her own hideout. And every day, Christian's demands became more twisted. At first, it was just about control, making her submit, forcing her to acknowledge that he held all the power. But soon, it escalated. Christian began to hurt her. Small things at first, slaps, shoves, cuts. But it got worse, much worse. He relished the fear in her eyes, the way she cowered when he entered the room. Outside the cabin, the world continued to spin. Blake was behind bars, awaiting trial, and everyone believed Jessica Washley was dead. But she wasn't. Not yet. Christian's plan, however, didn't end with keeping Jessica captive. He had bigger ambitions. He wanted to clear Blake's name, not out of some sense of loyalty, but because it amused him. He wanted to manipulate everything, to prove how smart he was, how untouchable. So, after weeks of tormenting her, Christian killed Jessica. It was brutal and messy. He stabbed her repeatedly, watching with cold fascination as she bled out on the floor of the cabin. When she was finally dead, he planted evidence carefully, meticulously. He made it look like Jessica had been hiding out with the help of Blake's ex-girlfriend, Amy. Amy had always been the jealous type, and Christian knew that if he played his cards right, he could make it seem like Amy had found out about Jessica's plan and killed her in a fit of rage, hoping to pin the crime on Blake. He took Jessica's body and dumped it in a nearby river, weighting it down so it wouldn't surface for a while. Then, he scattered bits of evidence, Amy's hairbrush, a few personal items, around the cabin and in Jessica's car. It was all so perfectly orchestrated, so seamless. When Jessica's body was finally found, the police were baffled. The discovery of the cabin and the planted evidence shifted suspicion away from Blake entirely. It didn't take long for Amy to become the prime suspect. Christian made sure of that. He even tipped off the police anonymously, providing just enough information to point them in the right direction. Blake was released from custody, his name cleared, while Amy was arrested and charged with Jessica's murder. She protested her innocence, but the evidence was damning, and Christian knew there was no way out for her. He watched the trial with the same detached amusement he'd felt throughout the entire ordeal. No one ever suspected him. No one ever would. In the end, Christian got everything he wanted. He had destroyed lives, manipulated the justice system, and left 2 innocent people to pay for his crimes. And no one ever knew he was behind it all. Jessica Washley had thought she could control her fate. But in the end, she was just another pawn in Christian's twisted game.